Welcome to the Manager Involvement in Work Reintegration webinar. This webinar is part of our Return to Work, Stay at Work series. We're glad to have you here today. My name is Tanya Hyde, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I'm the project manager with the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Grants Program through the BC government. While we continue to see a few people are still joining us, while we're waiting for them, I'll run through just some of the technical aspects of the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing, as well as to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. I'll be collecting all the questions submitted throughout the presentation, and we'll follow the presentation with a question and answer session. Any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and posted on our blog, and the presentation is being recorded and will be posted for free on our website. This presentation is also based on a research article which has been made open access through the Work Journal. So a link to that will be available as well, and you can review the research that this presentation is based on. You'll be emailed direct links for all of these items once they're available. As I mentioned, my name is Tanya, and I'm moderating the session and handling the Q&A session today. And our presenter is Dr. Karin Maiwald. Dr. Maiwald is the owner of Work Health Connection Consulting, a newly established independent consulting agency in Nelson, BC. And she has a PhD from Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And before her graduate studies in health sciences and public health, she gained extensive clinical experience as a physiotherapist in the public and private sector. She worked as a research fellow at the former Occupational Health and Safety Agency for Healthcare, BC, and completed the Work Disability Prevention CIHR Strategic Training Program at the University of Sherbrooke. Karin is interested in investigating the tension between policy intentions and policy outcomes in the domain of health and participation and support for work disability policy development. I will hand it over to you, Karin.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Tanya, for your kind introduction. Good morning, and everybody in BC, and in the other provinces, good afternoon. I heard that people from different disciplines in several provinces joined the webinar today, and I would like to thank you all very much for your interest. As Tanya mentioned, this study is published in Work and was done in collaboration with Dr. Agnes Meershoek, Dr. Angelique de Rijk, and Professor Dr. Frans Nijhuis from the Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The study was supported by former Occupational Health and Safety Agency for Healthcare in British Columbia and facilitated by employers and various unions. As mentioned, the title of today's presentation is Manager Involvement in Work Reintegration. The reason why I chose to put a question mark in the title is because I found something unexpected in my studies on disability management in the BC healthcare sector. Employer and union agreed upon disability management frustrates managers in daily practice and might stunt the prospect of workers with incapacities to return to work and can even go against the natural recovery pace. Let me explain. Work disability with sickness absence is an economic and a sociological problem. Disability schemes and support programs are a big problem for policymakers because they are costly. For managers, sickness absence is a problem because they cannot get the work done. For workers, it is a big problem if they cannot go to work. In Canada and also in other countries, the ambition is to support workers with work incapacities and health-related problems to keep their job. One possibility to encourage work participation is through early interventions. These programs aim to get workers back to work before full recovery and stimulate early return to work. Return to work, or work reintegration after work disability with sickness absence is considered necessary to support workers' health and social inclusion. Now, to reduce work participation problems, it's seen as crucial to get a correct medical diagnosis when workers report sick for work, and also to get an understanding of the worker's situation and health-related problems. This is important in order to avoid worsening of mild symptoms and enduring limitations, and also in order to get the necessary support in place for gainful employment. In Canada, employers and unions play an important role in developing disability management and return to work interventions. The idea is that this so-called bipartite approach helps to make early return to work policy more workable, viable in the daily practice. Now, healthcare organizations in BC, Canada use such a bipartite approach to develop disability management and early return to work interventions. The agreed-upon policy seemed to reduce costs and get workers back to work sooner. However, we do not know whether the policy works as intended in regards to current ambition. That is what I studied in the last few years. The main research question I had was, does the bipartite approach function for addressing work disability with sickness absence? I did 4 empirical studies to answer that question. In this webinar, however, I will present only one of the studies, which focused on the manager's experiences with the disability management program and early return to work interventions in the BC healthcare setting. The study focused on a specific component of the disability management program, namely manager collaboration or involvement in return to work planning, which is supposed to be facilitated by workplace occupational health professionals, which I mean here is disability management staff and union representatives. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Today I will, among other things, talk about the policy studied in more detail, the selected policy evaluation approach, the manager's struggle to implement the policy in the daily practice, the inflexibility and inability of arrangements on workers' incapacities and return to work process, and what to do, 3 proposals. First, the return to work policy studies. In 2009, as part of the collective bargaining process, and with the involvement of employers and unions, disability management in the healthcare sector in BC was adjusted. Agreed upon strategies were that a disability management professional was given the responsibility to prepare a return to work plan for a worker who reported sick for work and to get the worker's perspective on the plan. Disability management staff is obliged, using the medical diagnosis and recommendations made by a physician, to build a plan on. They are also supposed to involve other stakeholders, such as the frontline manager and the trade union representative, to settle on the direction of the return to work plan. I note that in Canada, a trade union representative is expected to help build a return to work plan. The bipartite policy formulation in the setting thus draws a parallel between workplace-based disability management staff and union representatives, their involvement in implementing the disability management program in the workplace. Other strategies are that absent workers should reintegrate before full recovery of their ill health problems and or with permanent work incapacities. And return to work plans are expected to be made for 4 to 6 weeks, however they can be extended. Return to work programming is further supposed to include access to various support services, for example, an ergonomist or workplace-based rehabilitation advisors, counselors, etc. The Canadian social arrangement regarding sickness absence are too complex to explain in the time given, but in brief, as most of you probably know, workers with ill health problems have to deal with different insurance agencies when they report sick for work. Depending if sickness absence is considered work cost or non-work cost, or as a result of a motor vehicle accident, the worker enters different disability schemes and support programs. Employment status for regular staff is secured for about 2 years in this setting, and for all workers, basic healthcare costs are covered on the basis of a public healthcare system. Now, I realize this slide is very theoretical, but please allow me to go over the selected policy evaluation approach for this study. To study how return to work policy works from the manager's perspective in the BC healthcare practice, the social constructivist view on the policy process was taken. This is because workplace policy often turns out differently and in unexpected ways in practice, and can have normative consequences. This happens because policies and procedures that have to govern daily practice include general rules that are based on general assumptions of the situations in that same practice. The general rules and policies permit discretionary space for those who deliver the services and have to apply these various rules and policies individual situations. Now, discretionary space on the one hand allows for including individual differences and contextual circumstances in return to work decision making, in the implementations of the rules and the policies in practice. In that way, discretionary space is thought to enhance fairness in processes. On the other hand, as the rules and the policies itself do not predict how the discretionary space is used in practice, this space also counts for transformations in the rules and the policy intentions. In applying the abstract rules and policies to concrete individual cases, rules have to be interpreted by various people. This process of interpretation in practice is influenced by professional norms, social customs, peer norms, moral beliefs, and existing practices which may transform the meaning of the rules and the policy as intended. Now, as the interpretation and applications of the rules and policies is a highly contextual enterprise, the implementation of the rules and policies often has unpredictable consequences. Now, although it's impossible to control the return to work policy implementation process, insight in and understanding of the context in which the policy has to function can help to optimize the exact policies in terms of better adaptation to the workplace, and therefore decrease the risk of unintended consequences in the local context. Now, with all this in mind, the research question for this study was, how are the managers experiencing their new role in return to work trajectories, and do they consider the policy as supportive for work reintegration process? Again, insight in the daily practice will provide insight whether employer and union involvement in developing disability management and return to work interventions indeed guarantees that policies are adjusted to the dynamics of everyday return to work practice. This study took place in the largest and considered leading health organization in BC, which provides general and specialized public healthcare services to a large portion of the provincial population. As per collective agreement, this organization created workplace return to work policy for its 22,000 employees. To answer the research question, a qualitative research design was selected. The social constructivist perspective was taken, aiming to show the processes of giving meaning to the return to work policy in the practice, in the local context. Managers were defined as the clinical managers and direct supervisors who had or still were involved in reintegration of workers between April 2009 and June 2010. Proposed sampling strategies were chosen, and interviewees ranged in management level, differed in age from 35 to 60, included both new and experienced managers and managers from various size departments who delivered different healthcare services at multiple work sites. Those willing to participate, but who only held return to work experiences previous to April 2009, were excluded from this study. 10 in-depth interviews with different managers who were each involved in the return to work process of various reintegrating workers at diverse work sites within this healthcare organization took place. The individual in-depth face-to-face interviews took from 40 minutes to 2 hours and were taped and transcribed verbatim. The analysis focused on how the managers interpreted the policy and what problems they experienced in implementing the policy in practice. What we saw was that there were 3 main phases regarding manager involvement in return to work. First phase, return to work plan design. Second phase, execution of the return to work plan. And the third phase, final reintegration strategy. What we saw is that in the practice, work reintegration is not clearly structured. The return to work process is not simply onward and upward, and is ever developing. Firstly, managers pointed out feeling unheard in developing return to work plans. Now, the procedure calls for a disability management professional to determine safe work options for the reintegrating worker and ask for manager's input in preparing a return to work plan. A group meeting is supposed to be held with the manager, the worker, union steward, and possibly other involved stakeholders to review and finalize details of the plan. The manager's first concern was that return to work policies and procedures were unclear to them. They felt unaware of where to find disability management and return to work intervention information. For example, on possible steps to take in return to work, contact information if problems occurred. The manager's second concern was that an expected routine in organizing work reintegration was not happening. For example, they indicated not receiving any kind of update on the worker's recovery and progress, and/or an anticipated return to work date and readiness to meet work demands. That was confusing to them. The third concern the managers pointed out were the developments of the return to work plan itself. The managers felt unclear on how return to work assessments came about, and keeping privacy rules in mind, they were unsure what they could ask to clarify in meetings. In turn, the managers often did not understand the given return to work advice when return to work started. They could also not suggest appropriate adjustment on moments they were asked for input, and were hesitant to make workplace adjustments that appeared to be inadequate. In similar vein, managers experienced selected support services on the plan would not work on the floor, and yet they felt not able to influence the made choice. One manager puts it this way. Now I'm not going to read this quote to you. And you can read that if you could. In return to work practice, managers expect easy access to disability management programming and return to work intervention. They also expect better insight in workers' limitations and expected progress, yet they did not receive this. On the contrary, managers are left to feel confused about return to work and dubious about return to work plans made. They feel they cannot contribute their workplace practical insight to improve the plan before finalizing it. In short, details are not worked out before return to work starts. Secondly, managers mentioned getting frustrated in executing the return to work plan. First of all, managers saw themselves as having a key role between the worker and the workplace in return to work interventions. And there's a nice quote here, somebody explaining this. I think that the manager has a really key role in helping the employees see what's happening in the workplace. I think that's the extent of it. We have to help them, and that we're interested in having them back to work, but not having them back to work if they're not able. If they're not able to complete work, then it becomes a risk issue for themselves and a risk issue for care. From this perspective, the first concern regarding the return to work plan was that reintegrating workers did not always function as well as expected, according to the managers. They felt the worker was sometimes unmotivated and or they did not meet what they perceived as agreed upon tasks and duties. Knowing how to approach this with the worker was difficult for them. The second concern the managers pointed out was that difficulties in return to work at the workplace, for example, the worker reported sick again. This could, in their view, create unwanted tension on the floor. They stated that repeated sickness absence and limited workability puts more responsibility and pressure on co-workers. The third concern the managers pointed out were unfulfilled expectations of monitoring by experts. They encountered that disability management staff did not help in a timely manner to deal with practical difficulties they brought forward, for example, through email. Managers felt they were countered with must arguments to follow organizational structures versus ensuring the appropriateness of plans. At times, managers expected that disability management staff and union representatives would help them to problem solve, but instead they felt being countered with arguments to follow the rules, for example, collective bargaining agreements. In return to work practice, managers cannot get practical difficulties in return to work addressed, and practical insights are not integrated to optimize plans in return to work trajectories. Thirdly, managers highlighted getting overextended in keeping workers with incapacities at work. In the final phase, formal assessment on return to work or integration to the own job or an accommodated job is completed. Workers are no longer designated for return to work programming or extra support services and are expected to complete duties and tasks in line with the job responsibilities. The first concern the managers highlighted was that workers' capacities to meet the complexities of work remained unpredictable and unexpected limitations could still become more clear over time. Sometimes they noticed because co-workers discreetly or silently indicated to them that errors in patient care were made in accommodated jobs. This created tension on the floor regarding safe and quality service delivery. I'm not going to read this quote to you. The managers mentioned tenseness at the department rising. And it has to do also with the tension around people reporting sick at times or frequency of reporting sick, as the reintegrating workers were on occasion assigned duties and tasks which other staff considered promotion opportunities. The second concern the managers pointed out was the lack of follow-up care to deal with such unforeseen practical difficulties in relation to the reintegrated worker and the workplace. Without going into further detail here, managers argued that experts encouraged a keep-going approach when managers contacted them. In doing so, the experts failed to acknowledge they might set reintegration up to fail. They didn't understand the difficulties we were talking about. The people in terms of the organization were useless, absolutely non-helpful. In return to work practice, the managers did not get help they needed to meet return to work and healthcare objectives, which is to deliver safe and quality healthcare services. Now, what we saw was that the managers responded in different ways to these practical bottlenecks. In some situations, managers left it up to the worker to report in sick again, whereas other managers attempted to work out details. Getting a better understanding of what was going on from workers' perspective was important. However, this could require a shift in working relationships. For example, for the worker to start sharing personal or private difficulties. For the individual and team to cooperate, which is a give and take approach, which did not always occur. Or sometimes the reintegrated worker really needed to see a physician for better diagnosis and in turn better targeted treatment and support at the workplace. The managers mentioned successful interactions with knowledge allies they had, for example, the College of Nurses, the unions which supported them in return to work, their professional associations, Building this bridge between external health professionals and the workplace, however, was a lot of effort and took time. There's a quote coming up. I had to do a lot of work around articulating what we were seeing and whether this made any sense for the worker and gave him stuff to take to his physician. What worked well was finding to help both this employee and his physician realize that by continuing to put him in the workplace, he was going to lose any perspective, which in my mind was completely unfair. Based on the experiences with and perceptions of managers on return to work policy, this study demonstrates there is much tension between the employer and union agreed upon return to work policy and the daily practice. The managers experienced that return to work procedures did not comply with the work they had to do. On moments the managers were asked for input on a return to work plan, they do not know where to adapt the workplace to for supporting return to work. The managers were expected to support the worker and think along to perhaps modify the return to work plan, yet they also countered lack of recognition of practical insights by occupational health professionals, meaning disability management staff, as well as union representatives. Over time, the managers cannot get or keep adjustments in place. Managers are in a tough spot. Now, what is common in this context is that workers, which was another study done, also struggled with return to work policy in the practice in this setting. In this study, it was noticed that they oftentimes feel being backed in a corner and experience not in control of their return to work trajectory. Now, even though the idea is to give the manager and worker more responsibility in return to work, these stakeholders both feel they cannot complete responsibilities in return to work process. Offered occupational health professional support, again, disability management staff and union representatives, are not experienced as a solution to this paradox. Managers frequently feel they cannot get blamed for poorly implemented return to work policy and experience being unable to meet both the new return to work and safe and quality healthcare service delivery objectives. In return to work practice, an experienced bottleneck for participation in return to work focused on the misfit to which extent return to work could be planned in advance. What we saw is an inflexibility of arrangements on workers' incapacities and return to work process regarding the timing of involvement, working with short and finite time frames of 4 to 6 weeks, having to deal with strict formalized plans from the start of reintegration. In order to improve return to work practice, I suggest regulating the implementation process. Return to work structures need to be more flexible on return to work planning in regard involvement and return to work interventions in this setting. Having said that, another bottleneck and vital point for improvement is the inability of arrangements on workers' incapacities and return to work process. Workplace-based occupational health professionals lack necessary skills and competencies in their new role to bring the different perspective of workers and managers on the plan. To reach this, professionals have to adopt a reflective approach on the choices and arguments they make in individual situations. If I may, I would suggest reading another upcoming publication in Work, Policy on Professional Support and Return to Work, Occupational Health Professionals' Experience in the Canadian Setting, regarding this suggestion if you are interested. What we saw in this study is that employer and union involvement in developing a disability management program and return to work interventions in a BC healthcare setting does not secure implementation of the return to work policy in practice and does not guarantee that policies and procedures are adjusted to the dynamics of everyday work practice. Return to work structures need to be in good balance between flexibility to safeguard involvement of managers and also workers, and strictness regarding responsibility for enforcing rules such as the task of occupational health professionals to meet the joint duty for enabling equal participation in the workforce. Lastly, I suggest more research is needed what input employer and union representatives do have in developing disability management programming and early return to work interventions, and how these policymakers interpret and translate managers' and workers' interests in policy. I would like to acknowledge former OSA, British Columbia, and the Maastricht University, the Netherlands. I would like to thank the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability and the journal Work for open access to the publication of this study. And the last slide, if you would be interested in more information on this webinar, as mentioned to Tanya, can be seen in the publication in Work through Open Access, and the other studies which I talked about are also mentioned here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Karin. That was a fantastic presentation. I do have one question so far. For those of you online, feel free to type in any questions you might have for Karin, and we'll go ahead and get them answered for you. One question is, what is meant by regulating the implementation process? It sounds contradictory to the flexible approach.
Right. Thank you. That's a very interesting question. The practice cannot be steered by rules alone. So it could be sounding as a contradiction. Regulating the implementation process, work the details out more, meaning give more space, as I explained fully, I hope. On the other hand, monitor indeed of the perspectives of the manager and the worker, get on the plan, and if indeed the occupational health professionals support these workplace parties in return to work process. That's what I mean by regulate the implementation process. Work the details out better.
All right, very good. And we don't have any further questions at this moment, but we can just give it a minute just to see if any more get submitted. Now you mentioned, you did mention that there was a second study that you had done. Is that one of these ones that's on your list here?
Yeah, so the 4 empirical studies which I mentioned, there was an initial study done on the design of the perspectives of the designers of return to work policy, as well as the deliverers and the receivers, which was the workers. But the other 3 studies was investigating, examining the experiences of the workers. Let's call that study 1, and then the experiences of the managers, study 2, and the experiences of the occupational health professionals, study 3. And the study 1 has been published in the Journal of Disability and Rehabilitation, and the study on the managers is in work, and as well the study on the occupational health professionals has been accepted by Work for publication.
Wonderful, that's really good. Let's see, I do have another question here. Someone asking if you have any opinions on performance issues during a GRTW.
Right, the GRT, graduated return to work. Performance issues, I have to guess a little bit, is that in relation to the occupational health professionals? Then yes, in developing the policy, put in a structure to ensure that the occupational health professionals perform in the sense that they support the manager and the worker to get a plan that works for them, that meets their needs. And again, one of the suggested ways to do that is through using a reflective approach at the workplace. So not necessarily through, again, more bureaucratic approach, but a reflective approach is seen as the best way at this point to advance professionalism. And what I mean by that, professionals knowing what to do, how to act, what action to take. So that would be in the performance. I hope I interpreted the question okay.
All right, and another question, are the studies based on workplaces that have human resources and active payroll and benefits administrations to assist in return to work?
Yes, these studies were done in the public healthcare sector, and there is human resource professionals in place. Yeah.
All right, and then another, what about employees who have performance management issues during their return to work?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
What about employees who have performance management issues during their return to work process?
Yeah, so this is all part of that conversation which I propose to dive into deeper. And the difficulty is just by putting everybody around the table, by sitting around the table, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can work out the difficulties that employees have or the difficulties that workers, that employers have. So because of there's a sense of being unsure in a group setting for workers, feel somewhat intimidated, and also privacy rules are an issue. So it is important to work out those details, but my recommendation would to work that out more separately and not necessarily in a group conversation. So because these are, but to really get an understanding of the worker situation and health related problems. So to come with the perspective, what are the difficulties here? What is this worker struggling with, and what can be done to support them? And to oftentimes it is seen as a behavior or motivation, whereas it could be further explained than that. However, again, it takes time to really get a good understanding of what the difficulties are and how this worker could be best supported.
All right, and then another question related to workers. Someone asked, were workers doing their full jobs when they came back in the studies that you did? And if not, what kinds of modifications were made?
Yeah, the workers, the managers, they came to the interviews having various workers going back to work. And as one manager was saying, I had 7 people failing their reintegration, hence they were really interested to talk with me. And so these were workers that were going back in an adjusted return to work, so an adjusted work situation, for example, shorter days, lighter duties, and in the 4 to 6 weeks that was sort of planned in advance how that would advance in terms of increased hours or an increased task to be completed at the end of the day. And that's what I meant. It was these plans were prepared in a fairly strict way, in a very short time frame. And what one of the managers pointed out is that why do these people need to come back? Can it be done differently? Why are they coming back at the busiest time of the day? And she really wanted to get the worker coming back and say on quieter times on the floor, and yet the occupational health professionals mentioned that was not possible to them because then they could not monitor and supervise the situation because they were not working. So it was difficult for managers to adjust the plans to make sure that these reduced hours were put to its best use. And yes, there was also workers being completely back at their old jobs. So it was all varied. There was varied workers involved that these managers supervised.
All right, and then someone asked, should a return to work plan include retraining?
A return to work plan can include retraining, yes. If that what is determined at that time as the possible solution to keep this worker at work, because that is the ambition, to keep the worker at the workplace, at work, because we know that it is really important for people to participate in the workforce, to participate in society, and to avoid social exclusion.
How do you best address non-work-related issues that are hindering return to work, for instance, chronic disease management?
Well, that's a very interesting question because this is where the managers pointed out really running into difficulties where they had in chronic care, unexpected situations happened, still complications of the disease were happening, and when they mentioned this, they felt they couldn't get plans adjusted, or they couldn't tap into return to work interventions such as maybe short-term again supernumerary worker or something that would help this worker with chronic disease to stay at the workplace.
All right, and then...
Did I grasp up? I feel I missed half the question, sorry.
Oh, well, I'll see if that person wants to clarify their question if they feel like there were piece of it that wasn't answered, so we can wait to hear back on that. There was somebody asking, how did the managers deal if they came across it? Any vacations during the work reintegration timeframe, 4 to 6 weeks?
Yeah, now that's an interesting one, and yes, that all makes it very difficult. It's all those dynamics, and that's what I partly mean by that, is already scheduled holidays, or during the return to work, somebody takes a holiday. I believe that is possible, but what is the difficulty is that the managers have to deal with all this in some way or form, and when these plans are so strict and short term, they feel they have very little wiggle room to support this return to work as best as they can. So that's what I mean with the structures or the return to work policies. They're delivered to the practice in a very strict, short-term, I would say rational, as if it's always stepwisely done, this return to work. Yet the managers are dealing with many, many, many different issues, which I hope I have explained. And they need more space to deal with all these differences, different situations, and various workers and various diseases.
All right, and then another question, was the Human Rights Code related to employer responsibilities in accommodation of employees, i.e. bundling of duties, scheduling adaptations to the point of undue hardship?
Please repeat that.
Was the Human Rights Code related to employer responsibilities in accommodation of employees? So, i.e. the bundling of duties or scheduling adaptations to the point of undue hardship?
Yeah, I hope I understand the question correctly. What I understood is that, and that was one of the things that managers encountered when they encounter difficulties and they try to have that conversation, what difficulties they were having. What they experienced is that the occupational health professional would counter them with, this is your duty to accommodate, this has to be done, and that didn't necessarily, they felt, help them. So they were hoping for a deeper conversation that would help them to get this worker back to work. In some situations it doesn't work, but to be countered with, this is human rights, or this is a collective agreement, you must do, you must. They felt they weren't heard what difficulties they experienced. So what they were saying was perhaps interpreted by the occupational health professional as, well, it's your duty to accommodate, versus really trying to grasp what the difficulties were that the manager was experiencing and how to possibly better support the manager in trying to keep the worker, keep their job.
Okay.
So if managers have difficulties or express difficulties, which can come through questions, which can come through comments, maybe the words that the managers are using as an occupational health professional, try to look at the message that's underneath there, would be sort of my suggestion from the study. What is the manager trying to say that you can work with, that you can do something with, versus perhaps countering with what should you do to accommodate? Because that doesn't help the manager at that point.
All right, and then how do you approach the return to work process when a significant period of time has been taken off of work, like 2 years, versus when it's a shorter period of time? Like, what are the significant differences to consider?
Well, that's very interesting, because that, again, that's the dynamic of the practice. That is a completely different scenario. I mean, there's what they also mentioned here, the easy ones. Do they all have to go into a group setting? From what I've heard in the practice, no, it's not always necessary that the worker, the human steward, the manager is there. However, when somebody has been for 2 years off work, the workplace has changed, the healthcare service delivery has changed. So before this person goes back to work, my recommendation is to work out the details before this person goes back, to avoid potentially having unintended consequences and perhaps setting up the return to work to fail. So allow, if possible, more time to work out the details before this person goes into the workplace, and really monitor and listen to what's being said, what practical difficulties are. Try to interpret what the worker and the manager are saying to take action to adjust the plan. Having said that, it's difficulties. Again, the dynamic is also influenced by the various insurance structures, right? It's a very dynamic and complex situation, and it makes it difficult for the people in the practice having to work with 4 to 6 weeks plans to get the necessary support in place. I hope I addressed this question.
All right, and then another question, I think this is particularly relating to healthcare. With the acuity of inpatients so high, managers likely do not have light duties to offer them. WorkSafe BC dictates very strict return-to-work plans with start and end dates. Do you recommend trying to sway third-party insurers from their practice of being very directive and less collaborative?
Well, yeah, that would be the inflexibility of arrangement, which I hope to have explained that. Again, it's there is need for more room, and by staying with these dictated 4 to 6 weeks, it doesn't necessarily support the workers or the managers to make it a successful return to work.
All right, well, I think that's all of our questions that we have right now. So I think we'll go ahead and end the session. Karin, thank you very much for your presentation. That was very, very good.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody online for joining us.